Okay, welcome. My name is Ken Coleman. I'm the director of the International Institute and also a professor of political science. This is a wonderful occasion to welcome to campus a graduate of the University of Michigan, Ambassador Susan Page, the ambassador to South Sudan. This event is co-sponsored by a number of units on campus. The International Institute has played the lead role in organizing, but there are several units within it that have helped. The African Studies Center and the Center for Middle East and North African Studies. Also on campus, the Ford School of Public Policy has been very helpful in Ambassador Page's visit, and the International Policy Center, which is also part of the Ford School of Public Policy. I'd also like to thank the Department of Afro-American and African Studies for their contributions. So today we have an opportunity to hear from Ambassador Page. We're going to do a question and answer format. We have 3 faculty members from the university who are going to ask questions of her about South Sudan. Following the question and answer period by the faculty members, we will then open the questions up to the audience. And the way you do that is you write your questions on the note cards that are on your seats, and you pass them to the side aisle. We'll have people collecting these questions. And I will be the all-powerful chooser of the questions. This is an efficient way to get a lot of questions out there and also to try to get a range of questions so we can cover a number of topics. So let me say a little bit more about our honored guest today. Susan D. Page was confirmed as ambassador to the Republic of South Sudan in October of 2011. She has been in Juba since December. Previously, she was Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, or State Department, in the Obama administration, principally covering Central and Southern Africa. She got her law degree at Harvard University after getting her BA in English at the University of Michigan.
Go Blue!
She is a fan. Am I right? It's been 20 years since you've been back on campus?
Yeah, and a little longer since I graduated.
Yes. Let's see, what else? She speaks French fluently and has studied at St. Andrews University in Scotland, conducting research on children and women's rights issues. So it's a real honor to have her back. She gave a talk at the law school yesterday, and now she's making herself available to us here today. Now, our faculty questioners today, our first will be Amal Hassan Fadlallah. She is a associate professor in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, and also Women's Studies, and also Anthropology. So she has 3 affiliations,
Michigan.
Very Michigan way. The second person is Ann Pitcher, who's a professor in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies and also of political science. And then John Charchari, who is an assistant professor in the Ford School. So they will hold the floor for a short period of time and ask questions of Ambassador Page. So Ambassador Page has been invited to give a few opening remarks about the South Sudan and about the situation there. And from there, we'll go right to Professor Fadlallah. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you
very much.
I guess I have a microphone. I don't actually need to get up. So I'll say here, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back on the Michigan campus. I was saying to some of our colleagues earlier that when I left Juba last week, it was 104 degrees, so this is a little bit of a shock to the system. I'm just going to really try to present a few of the outstanding issues that still need to be resolved following South Sudan's independence from Sudan in July of last year. And as well as just very briefly mention what our key issues are, our primary interests as the United States are in South Sudan. So first and foremost, we would like to see a stable democratic government with internal security, stability, economic prosperity and development throughout the country, as well as regional peace and security. As you know, South Sudan is in the neighborhood of some not so savory countries, and so we would like also for the two states of Sudan and South Sudan to be at peace one with the other. I'm just going to mention a couple of the outstanding issues or problems, challenges that South Sudan is facing right now. I'll just list them, and if you want to ask questions about them later, that's fine. So the most recent issue that you might have heard about has been the violence ongoing in Jonglei State in South Sudan. This is between the Lao Nuer ethnic group and the Merle ethnic group. So there are a lot of displaced people now who've been affected by that conflict. In most of the 10 states, there is some level of ethnic violence and tension, not all of which is surrounding water and natural resources. A lot of it is just ethnic violence, long-standing historical rivalries. Cattle, which is a way of life for a lot of the people. The average age, sorry, I'm on the wrong paper. The average age of people in South Sudan is 18. Literacy rates are amongst the lowest in the world at 24%. Maternal mortality rates are the highest in the world with 2,054 deaths per 100,000. 98% of South Sudan's government's income is dependent on oil revenue. But post-independence from Sudan, 70% of the oil lies in the territory of the South, but 100% of the infrastructure for exporting the oil lies in Sudan. Now that the government of Sudan and the government of South Sudan have been unable to resolve the dispute over what oil revenues and transit fees should be paid by South Sudan, as well as some financial arrangements to Sudan from the South, the government of South Sudan decided to shut down all of the oil wells. So they have created an austerity budget, but they have decided to allow the salaries of the Sudan People's Liberation Army, the National Army, and the police service to remain as they are, which, given that the budget for salaries is about 60% of their budget. So it'll be very difficult to see how they will actually make an austerity budget stick with those ongoing salaries that they want to pay. Fighting continues in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile states. These are actually two states that are in the north, but that obviously border South Sudan, and that have a lot of loyalty to South Sudan because they fought with them during the 22-year civil war before the CPA was signed. The government of Sudan has so far not allowed humanitarian assistance to go into those two states within their own territory, leading to a possible humanitarian crisis. And then lastly, some of the other issues that are unresolved between Sudan and South Sudan besides the oil are the territory of Abyei, whether it belongs in the north or in the south, and the final determination of the borders. So with that, I will stop and allow us, but I just wanted to kind of give a sense of what's happening in the country.
All right, so I think I'll ask my first question. First of all, I would like to extend my welcome to you as well, and to thank you for making this dialogue possible. My first question revolves around the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which is the agreement that ended the war between the North and the South in 2005. So my question is, why do you think the CPA failed to maintain the country's unity?
I actually don't think it failed to maintain the country's unity. The focus during the negotiations, and I was the legal advisor to the peace process, so I wrote major chunks of the peace agreement. The focus was always on unity. That is what the parties had agreed to, that they would negotiate on the basis of a unified state, but that they would, both sides would also work to make unity attractive. And at the end of the interim period, 6 months before the end of the interim period, the people of South Sudan would vote to determine whether or not they wanted to stay united or secede. Two questions, one question, united or secession, and they chose secession 98.8%. So I don't think that the CPA failed to protect unity. I would say that both parties had an obligation to make unity attractive, with the overwhelming emphasis on the government of Sudan. If you want to keep your people united, you also do have to make, I think, more of an effort to integrate the Southerners into the government and into the way of life and democratic institutions, and that didn't happen.
Okay, so I guess related to the CBA question is the ABA question, which you already referred to. So I'm wondering if the CBA treated ABA differently, and if so, how did this treatment resulted in this recent conflict or the contestations?
So, yes, actually, the CPA did treat ABA differently insofar as ABA has always been seen as a bridge between the North and the South, sort of between the Arab populations and the African populations. Both sides recognize that. They also recognize that ABA has always been the flashpoint. It was in 1905, it had been transferred with the agreement of the people in the South, it had been transferred to the administration of the North. This was an opportunity under the CPA to allow the people of ABA to decide whether or not they wanted to remain in the North or go to the South. The problem, I don't think, is actually in the CPA. It's in the fact that the priority on implementing all of the resolutions in the ABA protocol were not followed, so that the people of ABA never got their vote, which was supposed to happen simultaneous with the vote for the people of South Sudan. So that's where I see more of the problem. And then you have consistent incursions by the Sudan Armed Forces, or the government of Sudan, into ABA, scattering people who should have been the primary beneficiaries of that area. So the Ngok Dinka, who then have fled, allowing the government of Sudan to sort of infiltrate the area with people that they wanted to be there. So that's a major unresolved issue that is currently under a negotiation with the African Union High-Level Implementation Panel.
Okay. My second set of questions revolve around the U.S. policy towards the two Sudans. One of the questions is, many Sudanese elites in the opposition think that American policy is now heavily focused on the South and did not take into consideration what has happened after secession, such as the new war in Blue Nile and Nuba Mountains. So do you think this is a true statement?
I would take some issue with it. I think that we have tried to do a lot of work to improve our relations with the government of Sudan, not terribly successfully. It is a strained relationship. I won't pretend it's anything otherwise. It makes it very difficult when the government of Sudan has consistently bombed their own territory, the people in their own territory. Some of the bombings have occurred in the territory of South Sudan. The fact that they are unwilling to allow humanitarian assistance to go into Blue Nile and southern Kordofan, again, sort of starving their own people, makes it very difficult for us to then have a normal relationship where you can respect people's differences and not agree on all things of policy. But one thing I think most of us agree on is people should not be starved of life-sustaining food and water. In addition, we have tried to be balanced in our assistance to the African Union High-Level Implementation Panel that is charged with resolving these final outstanding issues, and not side with one side or the other as much as try to find a balance between what should work. And then the other complicating factor is that President Bashir has been indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the ICC, and International Criminal Court, and that makes it very difficult to, even though we are not actually signatories of the Rome Statute, Nonetheless, as a policy matter, we have decided, since he is not complying with the statute's commands of at least dealing with the ICC and reacting to them, making himself available, we will not have relations with the president of Sudan. So it makes it difficult to get our messages across. And then I would just say, lastly, I think everyone wants to see South Sudan succeed. And as a new country that is at the bottom of almost every single statistic, I think people feel that there's a lot more to do to make sure that South Sudan does succeed than there is in a country that at least has the institutions already in existence.
Right. Maybe can you give us more details on how do you see this new war? How is it different from the old war that resulted in secession? I mean, and how is it going to affect the new nation of South Sudan?
The fighting that's going on in South Kordofan and Blue Nile states, these two border states, they had the least pleasing outcome from the CPA, despite our best efforts, the best efforts of the mediators, to have the parties agree on something a little bit more rewarding for the people in these two states. The best that the parties were willing to accept was popular consultation, to basically suggest to the government at the local levels and then the national level on ways that the CPA could be modified to meet their aspirations. And in large part, although some of the consultations did take place in Blue Nile, none of the popular consultations happened in South Kordofan. Sudan has always had a problem with people on the periphery, and people in the Nuba Mountains, in Blue Nile, the Funj, as well as the Nubans, and people in the east, and people in Darfur. And so there are all these conflicts going on in all these other areas, and the government of Sudan, one way that it has managed to stay in place for so long, I believe, is because it negotiates these piecemeal agreements, and so you never get a real comprehensive agreement. Even the CPA, we were specifically prohibited from negotiating Darfur because the government of Sudan refused to allow Darfur to be included, because it was supposed to be, oh, everything else is fine, we are only negotiating the South. And even getting into the peace agreement, something is probably a little known fact, but the negotiations for the three areas, Abyei, Southern Kordofan, and Blue Nile, were actually negotiated separate from the rest of the peace agreement, and then were later incorporated. We got them to at least agree that the rest of it could be incorporated into the CPA. So it has made it very challenging. I think with the parties who are fighting and who have now created another alliance with other rebel factions or other dissatisfied citizens from different areas of the country, it's unclear how it will play out, but it does not bode well for either Sudan or South Sudan, because both sides have an interest in the way it will turn out.
Yeah, and I think this is part of the question as well. Like, I was following the news lately, and it seems that so many of the Darfurian rebels are now joining this new front. So I was just wondering, like, how, it will fuel the tension between.
And on top of it, not only have they joined, but the stated intent is to overthrow the current regime in Khartoum. So it's different from trying to make a peace agreement. It's trying to oust this particular government in Sudan. So that's a different state altogether. I mean, at least during the civil war with the Sudan People's Liberation Movement and army, the stated goal, not to say that they were angels, but the stated objective was to work for unity so that they could be a united country where everyone's rights would be respected as citizens, regardless of ethnicity, etc. This is very different. This is, we formally want to overthrow the government.
All right. So my last question is about the diaspora. how do you see the role of the Sudanese diaspora? Are they involved in, the kind of, are they influencing the policy, American policy towards the two Sudans? And if they're not involved, how can they be involved?
They are actually quite involved. One area that I think the U.S. government policy has been very consistent has been in support, bipartisan support for Sudan, South Sudan sort of negotiations, making sure that there's peace. And so there's a lot of support from Congress as well as foreign policy makers to listen to the Sudanese diaspora, both North and South. We meet with them regularly. I meet with them at the embassy. I've met with them in Washington when I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary. And a lot of people have come back. One of the things I mentioned yesterday at the talk was that there was an attempt a few years ago to bring a bill to the floor that would allow for student loan debt of South Sudanese, at least, maybe it was all Sudanese, but student loan debt to be at least partially forgiven so that the diaspora could in fact return home and be able to support changes in the country, democratic development, but also with all of the benefits that they had and the skill set. It didn't get very far, unfortunately, and I can't imagine in this particular time period that it would, but there were some moves along that front. I always think it's interesting, I'll just mention this as an aside, but the embassy in Washington, the South Sudanese embassy in Washington, they've had to actually get rid of their principal people because they're all American citizens. And they can't actually represent their government if they're, they can't be an American citizen to represent a foreign government. And lastly, in South Sudan, a lot of the diaspora who've come back to work and are working in some of the government ministries are American citizens. So it's very interesting. I think that there's a fair amount of that, but there's also some jealousy on the ground between people who stayed, who went through the war or fought in the war, and those who left either walked across. I mean, if people have read What is the What, some of the other historical books on Sudan and South Sudan, whether they got out, went to refugee camps, or were luckier and went further afield. So there's some tension between where people are coming back from, or if they are coming back at all.
Thank you so much. I turn it to my colleague.
Thank you. I'm Ann Pitcher. I'm in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies and Political Science, and I'd like to welcome you back to the University of Michigan. And thank you so much for giving not one but two talks since you've arrived. And I wanted to just point out my own work has been in Southern Africa, particularly in Mozambique and Angola and South Africa, all places that have also experienced conflict. And one thing that's come up in my research and in my conversations with donors in many of these countries is that donors sometimes have a mixed record with regard to how well they coordinate amongst themselves. And I was wondering if you could comment on some of the areas where our donors are harmonizing their interests and trying to coordinate amongst themselves. Maybe you could give us a bit of background on the number of donors who are in South Sudan, and also what some major areas of disagreement might be amongst the major partners.
Okay, the major donors are all there. I'm not sure if it's probably easier to say who's not there, but I can't actually think of who's not there. But the big ones, the U.S., the UK, Norway, the Swiss, the Dutch, the Nordics, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Kenyans, the Ugandans. I mean, so it's pretty much both Western as well as Eastern or Southern, whichever way you want to call that. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty wide range of donors. I would say, having I've lived now in 5 African countries, so I worked overseas in Africa for 15 years before moving back to the States 3.5 years ago. And I would say that so far we're doing a better job of coordinating than in most of the places that I've been. It could be because the government has recently come out with their development plan. It was presented in Washington at an international engagement conference in December, and where they laid out their own priorities and their own, not a wish list the way that lots of governments do it, but their priorities that was pretty well crafted. The UN, of course, is charged, generally speaking, with coordination of donor engagement. And I would say, by and large, it works pretty well. Of course, some of the areas work better based on who leads that cluster.
Right.
But that's always going to be the case where, you know, if you get somebody who's very organized and clear about what it is that they're doing, they can be, you know, a real advocate for making sure that everyone knows who's doing what. There is also a lowercase g6 group that meets weekly, and that's the major donors plus the World Bank and the UN, the deputy SRSG who's responsible for the humanitarian portfolio. So I think that works pretty well. And then one good example has been the health ministry, which has taken it upon itself to decide we are going to decide which donors work in which states so that we can make sure that all 10 southern states are represented effectively with donor assistance. So that's a really positive sign. It would be great if the other ministries could do something similar. So that's one of the things that we're trying to push is let's make sure that we know that everyone is working throughout the country so that you don't get 7 donors in one state and nobody in another one. So I think it's working pretty well.
Right. Are there areas where the donors disagree, or maybe that's too strong a word, but have different priorities or different ideas about how they would like to contribute?
There are, I would say, 2 areas that come to mind. One is DDR, demobilization, and that's a tough nut to crack when you still have low-intensity conflict in certain regions, and how you go about that. Unfortunately, a lot of demobilization programs have not, across the world, have not met with great success. And it's difficult. You know, we often think, oh, well, maybe this is an area that AFRICOM could help with, for instance. But, you know, militaries are good at mobilizing for the military. They're not necessarily good at demobilizing. So that's one area. And I don't even think that it's a big difference, but what is the priority? When do you start that? How do you collect weapons and not yet have livelihoods for people to go to? So I think it's I've said this in the last session, but kind of a chicken and egg. Do you try to demobilize first, or do you make sure that people have work to go to before you take away their weapons? And it's difficult. The other area I would just mention briefly is actually related to Southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, where the humanitarian workers and most of the governments really would like to see assistance going in from the United Nations or others to the people in Blue Nile and Southern Kordofan. And the government of Sudan, since it's their territory, does not want that to happen, in particular by the UN. They are really just don't like the UN. And so there's a question about whether people would be willing to provide assistance, food aid, into areas without the permission of the government of Sudan, and the risks that would be attenuated risks that could happen if they go ahead and do that without permission.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to move a bit to focusing on South Sudan itself and look particularly at the way that donors might influence South Sudan to democratize. Most peace agreements that have been signed across Africa in the last 20 years have included some kind of timetable for democratization. So I wanted to know how that's proceeding, or if it's currently off the table given the fact that conflict continues. And I thought perhaps you could share how that's going.
Sure. Now, we have to remember that the peace agreement that was signed was internal to Sudan.
Right.
So technically, I mean, you hate to say that something doesn't apply, but the interim period has finished, and so now it's up to South Sudan to develop its new constitution, and that's a key area where they could really do some democratic work. They did pass a transitional constitution, so they were able to hold up the constitution for the swearing-in ceremony of President Salva Kiir on July 9th, but they said all along that they were going to go through a broader constitutional process that would really be inclusive, and so they have created, in fact, many of the same models that were used in the creation of the CPA, creating a national constitutional conference, national constitutional review commission to review the laws, to review the Constitution, get some other examples, and they're meant to have civil society, other political parties, a broad range of actors involved in the drafting of the new Constitution, and then take it out more broadly to the population. This has been meeting with a number of challenges, and there's already a fair amount of criticism. They're only sort of just out of the box, but they're already meeting with a fair amount of criticism for not being as inclusive as they said they were going to be, or as people expected. So that's running into some challenges that we're trying to help them with by, again, pushing them, as well as helping them to create a timetable. Mm-hmm. The other area is they've just passed the political parties law, but it hasn't yet been signed into law. But it's made it through at least the cabinet, and it's made it through the parliament. So that's in the right direction. Mm-hmm. But media, a lot of journalists have been arrested and detained. They're taking on some of the qualities that you would like to hope that they would have avoided, given that they came out of a situation where a lot of that happened on a regular basis. So there's a fair amount of work to do, but they're in slow steps are making some progress.
Are you able to give direct support to political parties, or are you able to start training programs or information campaigns with various parties?
Yeah, we have had, the U.S. government has had programs through our partner agencies such as NDI, National Democratic Institute, International Republican Institute, to provide assistance in various areas, including political party work. We cannot give direct assistance to political parties. That's a prohibition. But helping them develop their political party structure, how do you create a political party constitution, all of those sorts of things. So that's been ongoing with IRI in the lead doing that. NDI has been focused mostly on the constitutional review process, as well as communications and outreach. So we are in a very lucky position, I think, because the South Sudanese really do appreciate the ongoing American support that they've had for a long time during the war. So we are well liked, but at the same time, they're not going to take all of our advice, but they do take some, and they do have a pretty open door with listening to us. I'd say probably the bigger problem right now is they're overwhelmed with people wanting to give them advice. And that makes it difficult because you try to get a meeting with a minister or a deputy minister, undersecretary, and they're all off somewhere on a training course. And that makes it difficult, but you understand as well that it's hard to decide what's more important. Government X is offering me something, so I'll rush off and do that, but then their day job also doesn't get done.
Right. All right, the last question I wanted to ask was about investment. And in addition to oil, I was curious to know what other sectors U.S. investors might be interested in. And I wanted to mention that I think it was 2010, August 2010, there was a small story in the paper about how when South Sudan became independent, they wanted to engage in some city building projects, and they had these grand plans to rebuild cities or to build new cities, and they had the plans in the paper, and they looked like fruit or animals. They had a wonderful one, I think a rebuilt part of Juba that looked like a giraffe. So I'm very curious about this. And there have been a number of other countries in Africa that have basically hired teams of private investors who completely build the city from the ground up. And I was wondering, is this proceeding? Is the U.S. involved? What kind of investment is going forward?
So South Sudan started off at least with a clean slate, no debt, and and the sanctions were on Sudan. So once they separated, they were also sanction-free. General licenses have now been approved to allow investors to operate even in the oil sector, which had been a specific prohibition through one of the through the Sudan Peace Act. So now people can apply for a general license. Essentially, you don't even have to apply anymore unless it's something very specific. So that's a real positive where, in that sense, I can really say as the ambassador, South Sudan is open for business. Mm-hmm. Of course, what do businesses need? They need security. They need to know that their assets are going to be protected. They need to know that their contracts are going to be honored. Sanctity of contract is important, and every once in a while, South Sudan will say something about wanting to renegotiate different contracts. Well, you know, for an investor, that, of course, strikes fear in their heart. There is a really big need for infrastructure investment in South Sudan, and there aren't that many countries providing that kind of assistance. There are very few paved roads. We are building the, can you say building a road? Yeah. So we're building a road which is the biggest will be the biggest highway in South Sudan. It's the Juba to Nimale Road, which basically goes out towards Uganda, which is their main trading route through Uganda and Kenya. So this will be a huge improvement. We have helped to rebuild bridges that were, destroyed. The Japanese are doing a fair amount on both bridges and roads. But, these are things that take huge, huge amounts of money. And that's not something that most of the investors are working on. I confess I've not heard of this sort of beautiful city plan. Every once in a while you do see something, a blip come up. But I haven't heard of the company that's supposed to do this. But they have been building, and it is improving. When I think back to the very first time I went to South Sudan, and went to Juba in particular, which had been a garrison state, so it had been controlled by the government of Sudan, there was nothing. I mean, the stadium was the best thing about Juba. And now there are buildings everywhere, and, there were a few dilapidated buildings that were the ministerial buildings, but now they're nice. There are a lot of, the airport road was the first one to be paved. And now it's developing and it's spreading out further, so you can see kind of the avenues that it's going further through. But big companies, I haven't seen that. So the other areas that people are looking at, though, for investment are wind, which is, I think, very interesting. Agriculture is a big one because they have a lot of arable land. I mean, South Sudan is a very small population, 8.5 million people, and huge, vast territory of land. So it does not suffer from what a lot of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa face, which is a dearth of land and certainly arable land. They should be a net exporter of food instead of an importer. So there are a lot of possibilities, but I think people are watching all these little ethnic crises and the conflict between Sudan and South Sudan, and are kind of feeling things out and waiting. Right. But the engagement conference really brought out a lot of investors, aviation, energy, not just wind and solar, I think there's a lot out there. I think there's a lot out there that people will be interested in doing, and they're starting to make trips to come out. But I think if they can see that the situation looks stable, they'll come in droves.
Thank you. I'll hand it over to you.
Let me just take this opportunity to remind you, if you have questions, write them on the note cards and pass them out to the sides. This side pass over there, and this side pass over there if you have questions, and we'll pass them on when we get to the general audience Q&A after John.
Good. Ambassador, thanks again for joining us. As you know, I'm John Chorchari from the Ford School, and I'm interested in asking a few more questions about the international politics surrounding the South Sudan. And the first, let's start with the UN. As you know, but some of the members of the audience may not, the United Nations set up a new peacekeeping force around Abyei around the time of independence last year. And there are now thousands of troops from various countries that have been contributed to help supervise the demilitarization of the area and prevent a relapse to conflict. I'm curious how much comfort you take in the presence of UN peacekeepers in that troubled area on the border, whether you think that the UN peacekeeping operation in Abyei has the personnel, the mandate, and the perceived neutrality to be a significant guarantor of the peace along the border.
Yeah, that's actually a really good one. The Abyei force, that's the UN force that's in Abyei, is actually all Ethiopian. They are not other troop contributing countries on the military side. So that both sides considered to be neutral. And the force commander who's in Abyei, in fact, I just had a meeting with the folks from Abyei. They really like the force commander. His name is General Tesfaye, and he's fantastic and has been able to garner the trust of both the nomadic groups as well as the Ngok Dinka. So that's been fantastic, as well as from both capitals. So that's great. I think that they're fully deployed now on the military side. Maybe 10 or 20 or something are missing, but basically fully deployed. And they have managed to stabilize the area. Quite honestly, if they hadn't been there, I'm not so sure that wouldn't have already gone up in flames. So that's been a really positive. I think had it been any other troop contributing country, it wouldn't have worked because one side or the other would have objected. So I think that's been probably one of the best things that has worked. They're under UN control, but essentially it's an Ethiopian operation, even though it's actually under the UN.
Thank you. At the time when the Ethiopians and some of the other civilians are working on that peacekeeping force, there, of course, is also the political negotiation on trying to resolve the border dispute in Abyei. You mentioned the role of the African Union high-level panel. The question I have is the African Union the right organization to be managing this dispute resolution process? Is it the only option? Are there others, such as the Qataris, who have played a role in the past, or the Chinese, who could play a useful bilateral role alongside or as an alternative to the AU?
The African Union high-level implementation panel was charged with assisting in the implementation of the CPA even before the CPA was signed. So in a certain sense, we don't have much leverage at removing that, and especially since every single statement that has come out from the UN, from the US, from all the bilateral donors has been, we strongly support the African Union high-level implementation panel. It would seem a little bit odd if suddenly, even if we have our private concerns, that we suddenly do a reverse course. And I think it would be very difficult to undo it. Having said that, there are a number of advisors that come from different countries that are either observers internally in the room as they negotiate or on the margins that are sort of in the halls of where they're negotiating. And oftentimes that's really where the deals are struck. So that's not necessarily a bad thing either. But they have been looking at whether or not they should create a sort of Friends of South Sudan or a Friends of Sudan, kind of like what we had during the CPA negotiations, that could provide more direct assistance to the AU high-level panel. That's something that they're discussing right now. But again, who should be on it? And do you create another monster by having another group with what authority? So it can prove useful, but it might also become too unwieldy. So they're exploring different possibilities. ABA is not so much a border dispute as much as where the people should have their allegiance. Should it be to Sudan or should it be to South Sudan? And they've already had arbitration to define the borders. It's one thing to talk about something, in the sky, but to actually demarcate it on the ground is partly what needs to happen. But they also people have to push both sides. In particular, I would say, in this case, to really push Khartoum to get their troops out and to allow the actual demarcation to take place and put in process some sort of a time-honored process for the referendum to take place. I think that because we pushed so hard to make sure that the South Sudan referendum took place and took place on time, we may have exhausted our leverage to make sure that the long-delayed referendum in ABA takes place. But what they need to do is they have to define the who the citizens are, the residents of ABA, and that's been the sticking point. So they have not been able to agree on who the residents are, who would then be able to vote. So even if you don't do a vote, who are the residents? You still have to get to that.
I'll ask just one more question, so I want to give plenty of time for our audience to ask some questions as well. And that is, to what extent can the peace talks between the two Sudans be separated from the issues that continue to transpire in Darfur or in other states that you mentioned, like Blue Nile and South Kordofan? To what extent tactically should those topics be separated out in an effort to prevent a recurrence of conflicts between the two Sudans?
In the best of all possible worlds, it would be great if all of the conflicts could have been incorporated into one agreement, whether that was called the CPA or the something. But one of the key issues in mediation is that you don't always get your way. And the government of Sudan was unwilling to allow Darfur to be part of this peace agreement, or the East, or other areas. And now that they have the CPA that in fact largely worked, they're unwilling now to have another process that looks like, oh, this is another CPA. Because they fear, in fairness, they fear, yet another loss of territory. We may see that this was, a good process that was a legal process that allowed the South to vote, and then they actually got their independence. But for the country of Sudan to lose a third of their territory, that's just, it's mind-boggling. So I think that their fear is, some new agreement will create another, okay, so Darfur is now going to split off, and then Blue Nile is going to go to the south, and that's their worry. So I think even getting to a real resolution of ABA is going to be very tough.
Thank you. I think that if it's okay with Ken, we can turn over to the questions from the audience.
All right. So a number of good questions that have come up so far. I haven't read all of them. But let me ask you this. A number of questions have to do with oil. And in particular, a lot of students, I think, and also in academia, professors and scholars are interested in this notion of the resource curse. And there's a number of questions about that and the idea that countries that become highly dependent on a specific revenue income from a very specific mineral or resource, that in the long run it prevents them from doing the kinds of capacity building and infrastructure building that they should be doing, and that countries actually do worse given this dependence on a specific resource than before they discover the resource. So can you comment on the role of oil in the prospects for Sudan, and how whether should we expect the resource curse to apply to South Sudan?
Sure. When South Sudan seceded, well, let me back up. During the negotiations for the CPA, when we were negotiating on the oil, it became interesting. It was called wealth sharing. And so that whole chapter in the protocol is called the wealth sharing agreement. And I always objected to that because it's not wealth, it's revenue. And even the way that they did the arrangements, it's interesting, that's the one section I say they and not we, but in any case, the way that the wealth sharing arrangement worked is the parties agreed to share 50% of the southern oil, but they didn't touch the oil that exists in the north, or in the north, which it resulted in a good agreement. So everyone's happy, but it's interesting that the north made sure that they got half of the revenue in the south, and that the south got nothing from the revenue in the north. In addition, although they do actually have other avenues of wealth or other avenues of resources, they have some gold, they have gum arabic. I mean, there are some other things that are there that wasn't figured in at all. So it was literally a wealth sharing agreement that only focused on oil. So that, I think, is quite telling. Right now, the biggest misunderstanding is on the transit fees and other fees related to the exportation of the oil through the pipelines that are in Sudan. So I think to a certain extent they've already begun. They began 6.5, 7 years ago living the resource curse once South Sudan started getting half of that revenue, which was 100% more than they'd ever gotten before. So, that money was just a huge influx of cash in U.S. dollars. And so, you get corruption, not that it's only through oil that you get corruption, but you had a lot of mismanagement and corruption. I'd like to hope that with the austerity budget and turning the pipeline, turning the oil off, that maybe they will take this time, maybe this could be a silver lining, that they could take this time to actually put the right procedures in place and do a better job of managing their revenue collection of other things, taxes, goods transported in, things like that.
So here's a question. Is South Sudan equipped to fight back in case a war broke out between the North and the South?
Well, they fought for 22 years. Technically, neither side won. So one would say, yes, they're equipped. They're not equipped with American equipment, but they're equipped. And I think the will is there, if that's what you're getting at. The area that the South does not have that the North has is firepower, aerial power. And that's where you see a lot of the strikes in South Sudan by the government, including even during the war, were always through bombing and aerial raids by Antonovs and helicopters. So helicopter gunships and things like that. And a lot of people say that the fighting force on the side of Khartoum on the ground is quite weak and very stretched because they're in Darfur, they're in the east, they're in the two areas. But I certainly wouldn't want to take a chance on that.
Got a number of questions about China. I'll ask one. Chinese companies, specifically developers, have rapidly increased their presence in Africa over recent years. To what extent has China become involved in the development and commerce in South Sudan?
The Chinese are the biggest buyer of South Sudanese and Sudanese oil, so they have a big say on the oil markets. In terms of other investment, they are doing some buildings, and they do tend to do a lot of infrastructure. But other commerce, I wouldn't say that they are playing a big role in commerce. But there are some infrastructure projects, and obviously the oil. So they have their oil offices are there. They're in a bit of a delicate situation because they have to maintain good relations with both Khartoum as well as with Juba to make sure that they get the oil. So they're definitely a real presence. They have an ambassador. They have an embassy there. So yeah, they're a player.
Can you speak to the role of religion in the political negotiations between Sudan and South Sudan? You referenced the legacy of the Arab-African difference, but I'm wondering, this is a voice from someone in the audience, I'm wondering if and how Sudan's historical attempts to forge itself as an Islamic state have influenced its current diplomacy with South Sudan.
Okay, so during the peace negotiations, religion was a big part of the negotiations. I think I told this in the class that the roundtable we just had, but I'll say it again for those of you who weren't in that class. We actually, at the beginning of the peace process, we actually wrote on flip charts, what does religion mean? So we broke it down. Khartoum, the government of Sudan, really wanted to have the state be, whether it was called an Islamic state, but they wanted it to be a religious state. And the Southerners did not want that. The SPLM did not want that. So we wrote on the board, what does secular mean? Because that's what, there was a whole declaration of principles which were supposed to be the guiding way that we were leading into the negotiations. So in the Declaration of Principles, Sudan was supposed to be a secular state. And so we talked about what does secular mean, and we literally asked both sides. They were sitting at the table. So we had like a table kind of like this, obviously longer, and you had the South Sudanese on the SPLM on one side, government of Sudan on the other side, us, the Secretariat back here, the drafters, and then the mediators up top. So we literally just sort of asked them, and we wrote on the board every time somebody said something, secular, anti-religious, not respectful, anti-God, all of the different thoughts. We did that with several different issues, but just on the religion side. And the preamble in that section on state and religion talks about how this state in the north would be run under Islamic law, under Islamic principles, and the south would be run under secular principles. We didn't use that term, but basically that was how we ended up dividing it up. I think that both the South Sudanese and the Sudanese are actually very spiritual people. I wouldn't necessarily use the term religious, but both sides are often very religious in their own ways. But they don't necessarily want, and even the Northerners, not necessarily the government, they just don't necessarily want somebody telling them what they have to do. So the average person is, in fact, follows Sharia law in the North. It's not an issue. They do what they do. They pray. But they just don't want the government deciding that this is what you will live under. So at the top level of the government, it's important to them because that's sort of the platform that they ran on, that they brought to the country. And for the South, live and let live. They're not particularly bothered by whether somebody goes to church or doesn't go to church, You know, a lot of people said, oh, it's only because the Southerners want to be able to drink their alcohol and, you know, not live under Sharia law in the capital. But, you know, a lot of Southerners don't drink, and that's not the issue. It's just that the historical fact of, you know, slave trade and all of that overhang is really heavy. I don't know if that answered the question.
Okay, there's a set of questions about food and farmland. So I'll ask one of the questions. Well, I'll ask both of them, and then maybe it's all wrapped up. Do any of the farmland deals by American citizens in South Sudan have legal standing, or will they? And related, how is the food situation, and what is the nature of food supplies in South Sudan right now?
Okay, I'm going to start with the second one first. The OCHA, the lead humanitarian organization, has said that about 5 million South Sudanese will be food deficient this year, partly due to bad food crops, bad, you know, crop year, and various displacements, et cetera. If you do the math, that's more than half the country. You know, 5 million of 8 or 9 million people. That's a lot of people needing food assistance. The UN does their regular humanitarian appeal and donor appeal. All of the aid organizations are really working full out to try to make sure that people do have assistance that they need, food aid as well as non-food items. The appeal this year was the largest appeal that they have ever done. So it's really very dire. And it's something that we are, all of us are doing as much as we possibly can to try to reverse that and get food to where it's needed. On the land, I've heard a lot about these land deals, and you know, I think that there are a lot of speculators out there from around the world who are coming in. I remember after the conflict in DRC, not that it's really over, but when it was over, all of these people coming in and trying to do deals, mining, everything, and getting their little papers signed and whatnot. You take a risk. I mean, it's one reason I've worked for the government my whole life. I'm not a real big risk taker. But, you know, if you're a risk taker and you feel confident that that 45-year deal for $30,000 is, you know, for, I don't know, how many hundreds of hectares is going to be beneficial to you, well, okay. So I think ultimately it's going to depend on what kind of deal was signed and whether or not the government will honor the deals that it has made and under what kind of circumstances. So the government itself has to also be willing to look at unscrupulous investors, and that's the case on anything, whether it's land or anything else. And right now they're kind of accepting lots of different offers, and I think at some point they'll have to sit down and say, okay, we need to systematically go through who's applying for this, what is our land law going to be, what kind of land tenure are we going to give, is it going to be a 99-year lease, will it be something different, because it's not just Americans, it's lots of different investors from around the world.
Okay, I have a couple of questions about corruption, and some of them have to do with the nature of oil revenues, but I think the more general question has to do with what the government in South Sudan is doing to try to prevent corruption from becoming a hallmark of its government and its society.
Okay, so the president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, announced this 100-day plan, and that in 100 days he wanted to see all these different things. They haven't made a lot of progress on all of them, but they've made some progress on some of these issues. But one thing that he did insist on was a declaration of wealth and assets. So people were to be fired if they did not fill out their declaration. And it was not to be only ministers, but, very much like, I don't know if the universities have to do this, but very much for us as senior government employees, you have to fill that out so that you can avoid conflicts of interest. So that's, I think, a really positive sign. And a couple of ministers have at least been sidelined. Whether or not they're ultimately going to be fired, I think we'll have to wait and see. Because you have to also do a due process. You can't just because they didn't declare something. You have to also look at it fully. The other aspect that they've done is to create an anti-corruption commission. And that, again, I think is really quite positive. It has some prosecutorial powers, and we actually have an anti-corruption advisor who sits with the minister, who sits within the anti-corruption commission. But the scandals are out there. They're well known. Some of them are well known. Grain, the cars, the passports. There are no shortage of things that need to be investigated. And, we are hoping by having an advisor in that we can also give them some good lessons learned and how you can go about making sure that there's accountability for this kind of corruption.
What are the prospects for the South Sudanese, with all their ethnic conflicts, creating a truly national identity?
I don't know. They have not really had that before. One of the things that sort of bound the South Sudanese together for so long was this fight against, the evil government in Khartoum. Successive evil governments in Khartoum, according to them. And now that, they still have it to a certain extent, but now that sort of the big bad boogie monster is off the table, a lot of the issues are coming home to roost within their own house. Some of that's to be expected. You don't expect a rebel movement to stay united as they become a government. That's natural. But definitely the splits are coming. And I would say within government, it's maybe a little bit less on the ethnic basis, but within the rest of the states, it's definitely a big issue. And it was one of the things that they said that they were fighting for was a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-everything culture, but they have to develop that. And that I think hasn't happened. They recognize that they could have done a better job at reconciliation during the 6.5-year interim period, and that's one of the reasons some of these crises have festered. But it's not the only reason. And I think if they could get some strong figures to come up with a really good way of Southern identity as opposed to, well, I'm Dinka, I'm Nuer, I'm Merle, I'm, anything other than that, or I'm from this region or that region, and it's going to be a challenge. So I'm hopeful, but I don't really see signs yet that they're making progress on that front.
Okay, here's another tough one. My question, this is from someone in the audience, my question is about Somaliland, a region that is seeking independence from the rest of Somalia. Somaliland and other regions in Africa see themselves as the next South Sudan. What is your opinion on regions seeking international recognition? Some of these regions have fulfilled standards for statehood.
Yeah, one of the reasons that makes South Sudan a little bit different was that so the African Union Charter is not anti-new countries, even though that's the way it is always spoken about. What they are opposed to is countries that declare autonomy themselves without having done it through some sort of a process that is internationally recognized. So one of the things that we had to do with South Sudan, as the tensions started increasing before the referendum, was to say, do not do a unilateral declaration of independence, which is basically what Somaliland and some of the other states have done, because it's not through a negotiated, internationally recognized process. And that's where you have trouble. That's one of the reasons why a lot of these states are not recognized. My opinion doesn't really matter so much, but that's sort of the general legal framework. Where it was more complicated, and this is much more for people who like to do the legal arguments, was that normally it's peoples who have the right to self-determination. And in South Sudan, it was a whole territory of the people of South Sudan who were allowed to vote for self-determination. So there's a legal distinction on that, and we had to go through a lot of issues debating whether or not that was enough to consider them as peoples, and because of the ethnic groups, ultimately that was agreed that was okay. But so that's not a full answer, but essentially what should happen is there should be some sort of a process for people to determine whether or not they secede from mainland X.
So in the last question, you ready for this? What was your journey from receiving a BA in English from the University of Michigan to becoming the U.S. ambassador to South Sudan?
That's your question.
No, it's not. Look at the handwriting. What advice would you give to current undergrads who have a passion for economic development and public affairs?
I'd say go for it. I have I had a sort of odd career track that I don't think I could even duplicate today if I were trying. A lot of it was just kind of hit and miss. I've always been very driven. So as an undergrad, majoring in literature, I did 3 years here, and I couldn't wait to get out. Loved my experience, but I wanted to be overseas. And so my senior year, which is totally weird, I was one of the first. Michigan had just started an exchange program with St. Andrews, and I was amongst that first class that went to St. Andrews and had to actually work, which you think, hey, it's senior year, you can kind of play a little bit. But it was wonderful, and just for me, it reassured me that my decision was right, that I really wanted to do something in international affairs. So I did that for a year, and then while I was there, I actually applied to law school on a manual typewriter. And yeah, it's really hard. Whiteout just doesn't look good on a law school application. But so I applied to law school, and every single summer I spent part of my summer overseas, much to my parents' complete and utter dismay. But I finally just decided, at that time, Harvard really didn't have a lot of international law programs. They had international business law, that sort of, international transactions. That was not what I was interested in. I took a course taught by a couple of Fletcher School professors on, asylum law, another one on, international humanitarian law or something like that. That was basically it. So I had to really kind of make it up. So during my 2L year, I applied for a fellowship. I was fascinated by Nepal and decided that's what I wanted to do. And I received a Rotary Fellowship. I studied in Nepal. I studied first the language at University of Wisconsin. Did an intensive language learning, Nepali language and culture. Went to Nepal for a year, did this research on women and children's rights, inheritance rights in particular. And I was done. I was gone. I mean, that was sort of, okay, how can I figure out how to keep doing this sort of thing? And my parents were like, you need to get a job. J-O-B. So, I was lucky. The State Department picked me up. I'd done something bizarre, but, went to the State Department in the Office of the Legal Advisor. But what I said to the law students here was, there are lots and lots of agencies of the U.S. government if you want to do international work. I mean, there's the State Department, there's Commerce, there's Treasury, there's NASA, NOAA, all the military branches. There is agricultural department. If you're interested, don't limit yourself to, the obvious ones. Go through a directory of government agencies and see which ones appeal. There's the CIA. You may be opposed to those sorts of things, but, look at the breadth of the opportunities that are out there. So I worked in the State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor for 2.5 years, and then figured out something that lots of, we call it L, the Office of the Legal Advisor, what lots of L attorneys did, which is to go on detail somewhere else. And so I technically worked for the State Department's Legal Advisor's Office for about 10 years, but actually was an attorney advisor for USAID first in Kenya, so I covered all of East and Southern Africa, then in Botswana covering Southern Africa. Then I came back to state after my detail and went out as a political officer to Rwanda, but also still covering legal issues. And then I left and went to UNDP, figured out it was an interesting experience, not necessarily for me, but I got a good experience. The State Department called me back, asked me to do the peace negotiations, and then sort of a different track opened up. So, I think it's kind of as varied as you can make it. Stay in touch with your colleagues. Stay in touch with your professors who have openings that, might be there. So, and I'm always reachable. I think it's a privilege to be in this kind of position. This is my dream job, but I've actually said that for lots of different jobs that I've had. And that's a real honor. So I would be happy to stay in touch if people want to send me an email, ask me a question. Can't always promise that I'll be prompt in my responses, but I usually do try to respond. So if anybody wants to, my email address, ready? It's Paige, P-A-G-E-S for Susan, D for Denise, at state.gov. P-A-G-E-S-D at state.gov.
Well, I think we all owe Ambassador Page a thank you for this. This is very...
Thanks, you guys.
Very informative and also inspiring. And thanks to Professors Fadlallah, Pitcher, and Chachari for their participation. Thank you for coming. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event at the International Institute. Thank you very much.